We often forget how much unites all the members of humanity. Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bond. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us? What could be more alien to the universal aspirations of our peoples than war and the threat of war?
All right, all you groovy, tuned in, turned on way out fans, here's a sample of your kind of music, Strange Brew.
Strange Brew. Yes. Strange brew, it will be sent to every country. They shall drink it down to the dregs. And if they tell you, I will not drink it, you tell them you do drink it, or it will be poured out upon you. And who drinks last? Sheshach drinks last. He gets to watch all the other nations drink, or get it poured out upon his head. And he drinks last. So anyway, let's continue here. It's part 8. Now, and we just encountered a mysterious figure who looked like a workman, so he's probably a Freemason. Mysterious Freemason comes out of nowhere and gives this man reading material and fades into the darkness where he belongs. And so now we're page 183. Remember, this is a critique of Mein Kampf, labeling Hitler as a benevolent psychopath, as I call it. It's the spirit behind Luke, I am your father, and whatever iteration of that. And so he talks about, thereupon I left the hall. Page 183 at the 3-minute mark. He says, at that time I was living in one of the barracks of the 2nd Infantry Regiment. Interesting. I had a little room which still bore the unmistakable traces of the revolution. During the day, I was mostly out at the quarters of Light Infantry, number 41, or else attending meetings or lectures held at some other branch of the army. I spent only the night at the quarters where I lodged. Since I usually woke up about 5 o'clock every morning, I got into the habit of amusing myself with watching little mice which played around in my small room. I used to place a few pieces of hard bread or crust on the floor and watch the funny little beasts playing around and enjoying themselves with these delicacies. I had suffered so many privations in my own life that I well knew what hunger was, and could only too well picture to myself the pleasures these little creatures were experiencing. That's funny. But then, of course, it's a little hint there of the Pied Piper. And remember, these things spread disease. They care not. And if your child was alone in a crib and there was enough of them, they would show no mercy. So it's this weird animal worship a lot of these people have. But anyway, I won't get into that. He continues, so on the morning after the meeting I have mentioned, It happened that about 5 o'clock I lay fully awake in bed, watching the mice playing and vying with each other. As I was not able to go to sleep again, I suddenly remembered the pamphlet that one of the workers had given me at the meeting. It was a small pamphlet of which this worker was the author. In his little book, he described how his mind had thrown off the shackles of the Marxists and trade union phraseology, and that he had come back to the nationalist ideals. That was the reason why he had entitled his little book, My Political Awakening. The pamphlet secured my attention the moment I began to read, and I read it with interest to the end. The process here described was similar to that which I had experienced in my own case 10 years previously. Interesting, 10 years gone by. Unconsciously, my own experiences began to stir again in my mind. During that day, my thoughts returned several times to what I had read, but I finally decided to give the matter no further attention. A week or so later, however, I received a postcard which informed me, to my astonishment, that I had been admitted into the German Labor Party. I was asked to answer this communication and to attend a meeting of the party committee on Wednesday next. That's what they perceive as Wotan's Day, which is Odin, who gave his right eye in order to have knowledge. So the right eye is the eye of honor for knowledge, which giving your right eye for knowledge is basically the definition of Gnosticism. That's why a lot of times a Gnostic is worse than a Satanist. I don't want to get into that. He continues, this manner of getting members rather amazed me, and I did not know whether to be angry or laugh at it. Hitherto, I had not any idea of entering a party already in existence, but wanted to found one of my own. Such an invitation as I now had received, I looked upon as entirely out of the question for me. I was about to send a written reply when my curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to attend the gathering at the date assigned so that I might expound my principles to these gentlemen in person. Wednesday came. The tavern in which the meeting was to take place was the Alte Rosenbad in the Herrenstrasse. That's like the Lord's Street. Alte Rosenbad sounds like the old red something. The old red city, maybe? Into which apparently only an occasional guest wandered. This was not very surprising in the year 1919, when the bills of fare, even at the larger restaurants, were only very modest and scanty in their pretensions, and thus not very attractive to clients. But I had never before heard of this restaurant. This is now page 184 on the 9-minute mark. He continues, I went through the badly lighted guest room where not a single guest was to be seen, and searched for the door which led to the side room, and there I was face to face with the Congress. Under the dim light shed by a grimy gas lamp, I could see 4 young people sitting around a table. One of them, the author of the pamphlet, he greeted me cordially and welcomed me as a new member of the German Labor Party. I was taken somewhat aback on being informed that actually the national president of the party had not yet come, so I decided that I would keep back my own exposition for the time being. Finally, the president appeared. He was the man who had been chairman of the meeting held in the Sternecker brewery, where Fetter spoke. My curiosity was stimulated anew, and I sat waiting for what was going to happen. Now I got at least as far as learning the names of the gentlemen who had been parties to the whole affair. The Reich National President of the association was a certain Herr Harrer. That actually sounds like Lord of Lords or Lord of the Lord of the City. It's a weird name. And the president for the Munich district was Anton Drexler. Interesting, like Osmosis Jones, the Drixenol. It's probably the same thing. But Anton is like Anthony. It's like a praiseworthy man. A lot of people like to take on that name. Anton LaVey, Anton Lewandowski, the leader of the Way of the Future Church in Southern California that wants to worship an AI robot, and he's an ex-CEO of Google who made $200 million in a year. But why pay attention to that? If you pay attention to evil, only evil will come. It's like, okay, whatever you say. The minutes of the previous meeting were read out, he says, and a vote of confidence in the secretary was passed. Then came the treasurer's report. The society possessed a total fund of 7 marks and 50 pfennigs, a sum corresponding to 7s 6d, 7 cents and $6, maybe, in English money at par. Whereupon the treasurer was assured that he had the confidence of the members. This was now inserted in the minutes. Remember, they always claim it's a grassroots movement, usually, because if it's Antichrist, then it's going to try to replace what Christianity was, or be a replacement. Then letters of reply, he said, which had been written by the chairman, were read, first to a letter received from Kiel, then to one from Dusseldorf, and finally to one from Berlin. All 3 replies received the approval of all present. Then the incoming letters were read, one from Berlin, one from Dusseldorf, and one from Kiel. In Hebrew, Kiel would mean like El. The reception of these letters, he says, seemed to cause great satisfaction. This increasing bulk of correspondence was taken as the best and most obvious sign of the growing importance of the German Labor Party. And then, well, there followed a long discussion of the replies which would be given to these newly received letters. So I want to note that right here, and I'm going to try to emphasize this if I can remember every episode from now on, what you hear now may be more full of lies than what we previously heard. So now he's talking about how all this formed. It could have formed that way, but now there's less people, there's less witnesses to what he's saying. The less witnesses you have in a book like this, you have to start taking it with a grain of salt. So he continues, it was all very awful. This was the worst kind of parish pump clubism. And was I supposed to become a member of such a club? The question of new members was next discussed. That is to say, the question of catching myself in the trap. I now began to ask questions, but I found that, apart from a few general principles, there was nothing, no program, no pamphlet, nothing at all in print, no card of membership, not even a party stamp, nothing but obvious good faith and good intentions, allegedly. Now this is page 185 at the 14-minute mark. I no longer felt inclined to laugh. For what else was all this but a typical sign of the most complete perplexity and deepest despair in regard to all political parties, their programs and views and activities? The feeling which had induced those few young people to join in what seemed such a ridiculous enterprise was nothing but the call of the inner voice which told them, though more intuitively than consciously, that the whole party system, as it had hitherto existed, was not the kind of force that could restore the German nation or repair the damages that had been done to the German people by those who hitherto controlled the internal affairs of the nation. I quickly read through the list of principles that formed the platform of the party. These principles were stated on typewritten sheets. Here again I found evidence of the spirit of longing and searching, but no sign whatever of a knowledge of that conflict that had to be fought. I myself had experienced the feelings which inspired those people. It was the longing for a movement which should be more than party in the hitherto accepted meaning of that word. Again, this dude really, really likes whatever German word translates into hitherto. He continues, when I returned to my room in the barracks that evening, I had formed a definite opinion on this association, and I was facing the most difficult problem of my life. Should I join this party or refuse? From the side of the intellect alone, every consideration urged me to refuse, but my feelings troubled me. The more I tried to prove to myself how senseless this club was, on the whole, the more did my feelings incline me to favor it. During the following days, I was restless. I began to consider all the pros and cons. You see how, like, the more he embraces the hatred and all that stuff, like, he doesn't even control his own destiny now. Like, if he wants to go to the side of the evil, he's gonna be put in wherever the Most High has designated the evil be put. And the good will be put wherever he designates the good to be put. You see how he's losing his own freedom? Because he doesn't want to be yoked to anything. But if you actually yoke yourself to Mashiach, Yeshua HaMashiach, and give all praise to Yahovah Sebaot through Ruach HaKodesh, then you're actually the most free, or at least it feels the most free. But he's even more submitting than the other side that claims they're free. So Mr. Hittite continues, I began to consider all the pros and cons. I had long ago decided to take an active part in politics. The fact that I could do so only through a new movement was quite clear to me, but I had hitherto lacked the impulse to take concrete action. I thought you were the master race, buddy. What happened? Did you have another little struggle in your skull? I am not the one of those people who will begin something, he says, today and just give it up the next day for the sake of something new. That was the main reason which made it so difficult for me to decide in joining something newly founded, for this must become the real fulfillment of everything I dreamt, or else it had better not be started at all. I knew that such a decision should bind me forever, and that there could be no turning back. For me, there could be no idle dallying, but only a cause to be championed ardently. I had already an instinctive feeling against people who took up everything, but never carried anything through to the end. I loathed these jack-of-all-trades, and considered the activities of such people to be worse than if they were to remain entirely quiescent. A jack-of-all-trade is supposed to represent what Messiah was. He was a tecton, which means he understood how anything worked. He could do any job and change it at any moment. So anything with tech in it, or tack, he could do. Architect, tactical. If you were to give a man like this a Gatling gun, he would be able to look at it, maybe fire it a few times, take it all apart, look at the components, look at the bullets, see what's sealing everything, and he would be able to put it all back together and actually improve upon it. So when they call Messiah a carpenter, it's kind of an insult, because it's kind of like calling a mechanical engineer a bolt tightener. Of course, mechanical engineers are going to tighten bolts, but that's not like the only thing they do. Just wanted to interject that there. So here we go. He's about to praise the divine feminine and use nonsense words instead of giving God glory. So Mr. Hittite says right here, Fate herself. Oh, I'm with her. I guess I know who he's voting for. So he says, fate herself now seemed to supply the finger post that pointed out the way. Always worshiping the Queen of Heaven, these people. Who is no queen, by the way, but you know what I mean. He then says, I should never have entered one of the big parties already in existence, and shall explain my reasons for this later on. This ludicrous little formation, with its handful of members, seemed to have the unique advantage of not yet being fossilized into an organization, and still offered a chance for real personal activity on the part of the individual. Here it might still be possible to do some effective work. And as the movement was still small, one could all the easier give it the required shape. So, this is now page 186, the last of this chapter, at the 21-minute mark. He continues, here it was still possible to determine the character of the movement, the aims to be achieved, and the road to be taken, which would have been impossible in the case of the big parties already existing. See, he's actually showing you that it's not grassroots. He's just choosing a party that's very small, that has similar ideas, so that he can grow something out of it. But anyway, he continues. The longer I reflected on the problem, the more my opinion developed that such a small movement would best serve as an instrument to prepare the way for the national resurgence. But that this could never be done by the political parliamentary parties, say that 10 times fast, which were too firmly attached to obsolete ideas or had an interest in supporting the new regime. What had to be proclaimed here was a new Weltanschauung and not a new election cry. Remember, Weltanschauung apparently is like, you know, a new movement or something. Kind of like a zeitgeist, I guess. I don't know. It's a Babylonian word. That's why they don't translate it, I guess. But it's literally the new thing. Like when they make that meme where it's like, I support the new thing. It's actually kind of what Weltanschauung probably means. I keep wanting to call it Weltanschauung. It's like, it's probably what they're meant to want you to say. Because you know how they go. So, Mr. Hittite continues, it was, however, infinitely difficult to decide on putting the intention into practice. What were the qualifications which I could bring to the accomplishment of such a task? The fact that I was poor and without resources could, in my opinion, be the easiest to bear, but the fact that I was utterly unknown raised a more difficult problem. I was only one of the millions which chance allows to exist. What? Or cease to exist, whom even their next door neighbors will not consent to know. Another difficulty arose from the fact that I had not gone through the regular school curriculum. Interesting. The so-called intellectuals, he says, still look down with infinite superciliousness on anyone who had not been through the prescribed schools and allowed them to pump the necessary knowledge into him. The question of what a man can do is never asked, but rather, what has he learned? Educated people look upon any imbecile who is plastered with a number of academic certificates as superior to the ablest young fellow who lacks these precious documents. I could therefore easily imagine how this educated world would receive me, and I was wrong only so far as I then believed men to be, for the most part, better than they proved to be in the cold light of reality. Because of their being as they are, the few exceptions stand out all the more conspicuously. I learned more and more to distinguish between those who will always be at school and those who will one day come to know something in reality. It's interesting. After 2 days of careful brooding and reflection, I became convinced that I must take the contemplated step. It was the most fateful decision of my life. No retreat was possible. See, he's talking about the point of no return. That's why I'm saying take this with a grain of salt, because he might just be joining some weird society or trying to create a secret society. I don't know. He says, thus I declared myself ready to accept the membership tendered me by the German Labor Party and received a provisional certificate of membership. I was numbered 7. Interesting. There is a 7th. He remains a little while. And afterwards, a child is born, who is the 8th, who belongs to all the genetics of the 7th, and the 6th, the 5th, the 4th, the 3rd, and the 2nd, and the 1st. And he is going to destruction. And 10 horns, or strategoi, will reign with this man, and will burn up a certain mystery Babylon woman. And I've gone over who that is. And they're looking for the destruction of Soviet Israel in order to foment their New World Order, but I won't get too much into that right now, because I mention it in little pieces, because I have to stick to the task at hand. So now it's chapter 10, or chapter X. Why the Second Reich collapsed, in his opinion. So this is page 187 at the 27-minute mark. Mr. Hittite says, the depth of a fall is always measured by the difference between the level of the original position from which a body has fallen and that in which it is now found. Interesting. Read that one more time. The depth of a fall is always measured by the difference between the level of the original position from which a body has fallen and that in which it is now found. This seems to be a truth about Satan himself, right? We weren't made in the heavens first. We were put on earth first. There's a great mercy there, because Satan was one of the hosts of the heavens. He was one of the angels. And he fell from a position of which there is no rising. It's very, very interesting. And then, of course, dimensionally, what Messiah did was conquering all of that. He began in the heavens, willingly submitted to the flesh, and thus his flesh being destroyed, in his flesh he saw Elohim, and he saw him for himself, and he saw no other. He went all the way down to that first dimension. He took the keys and united all things, but I don't want to get too much into that, even though it's beautiful. So let me read this again. I think I read it, but I forgot. So he says, the same holds good for nations and states. The matter of greatest importance here is the height of the original level, or rather the greatest height that had been attained before the descent began. Think of Rome, because in Hebrew it's Rum, which is the most ripe you can possibly get. So if you the most ripe you can possibly get, like Abraham, Abram, if God preserves that, then you're eternally fully ripe. If you are materialistic like Rome, you get right on the cusp of where it starts fermenting, which can get people drunk, and then it rots, which makes the stomach sick. But anyway, he continues, for only the profound decline or collapse of that which was capable of reaching extraordinary heights can make a striking impression on the eye of the beholder. The collapse of the Second Reich was all the more bewildering for those who could ponder over it and feel the effect of it in their hearts, because the Reich had fallen from a height which can hardly be imagined in these days of misery and humiliation. The Second Reich was founded in circumstances of such dazzling splendor that the whole nation had become entranced and exalted by it. Remember, what is exalted in man's eyes and is an abomination to Yahovah. Amen. He continues, following an unparalleled series of victories, that empire was handed over as the guerdon of immortal heroism to the children and grandchildren of the heroes. Whether they were fully conscious of it or not does not matter. Anyhow, the Germans felt that this empire had not been brought into existence by a series of able political negotiations through parliamentary channels, but that it was different from political institutions founded elsewhere by reason of the nobler circumstances that had accompanied its establishment. When its foundations were laid, the accompanying music was not the chatter of parliamentary debates, but the thunder and boom of war along the battle front that encircled Paris. It was thus that an act of statesmanship was accomplished whereby the Germans, princes as well as people, established the future Reich and restored the symbol of the imperial crown. Bismarck's state was not founded on treason and assassination, according to Hitler. That's his opinion. Not founded on treason and assassination by deserters and shirkers, but by the regiments that had fought at the front. This unique birth and baptism of fire sufficed of themselves to surround the Second Empire with an aureola of historical splendor, such as few of the older states could lay claim to. He literally just said the aureola of whatever. And what was an ascension? Oh, and what an ascension then began. Remember, ascension is always satanic. Messiah didn't ascend into heaven, he expanded into heaven. When you understand dimensionally, there is no up and down. There is no left and right. There is only within and without. That's why it says neither turn to the right hand or the left, but go the narrow way. It's talking about your perception. Don't look back, always go forward in your perception and find Mashiach. I've always showed the perception charts and everything. So he continues, and what an ascension then began. A position of independence in regard to the outside world guaranteed the means of livelihood at home. The nation increased in numbers and in worldly wealth. The honor of the state and therewith the honor of the people as a whole were secured and protected by an army which was the most striking witness of the difference between this new Reich and the old German Confederation. Confederation, very interesting. So this is now page 188 at the 34-minute mark. If it's 88, I wonder if he's going to mention the sun and moon at all. Let's see. He continues, but the downfall of the Second Empire and the German people has been so profound that they all seem to have been struck dumbfounded and rendered incapable of feeling the significance of this downfall or reflecting on it. It seems as if people were utterly unable to picture in their minds the heights to which the empire formerly attained. So visionary and unreal appears the greatness and splendor of those days in contrast to the misery of the present. Bearing this in mind, we can understand why and how people become so dazed when they try to look back to the sublime past that they forget to look for the symptoms of the great collapse, which must certainly have been present in some form or other. That's true. People always don't pay attention to a future collapse. They like to delusion themselves, no matter how many signs there are. He continues, naturally, this applies only to those for whom Germany was more than merely a place of abode and a source of livelihood. These are the only people who have been able to feel the present conditions as really catastrophic, whereas others have considered these conditions as the fulfillment of what they had looked forward to and hitherto silently wished. The symptoms of future collapse were definitely to be perceived in those earlier days, although very few made any attempt to draw a practical lesson from their significance. But this is now a greater necessity than it ever was before. For just as bodily ailments can be cured only when their origin has been diagnosed, so also political disease can be treated only when it has been diagnosed. See, this is where we run into that whole see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. It's like, notice those statues are all monkeys. They're monkeys. So you have a political disease can only be treated when it has been diagnosed. If you tell people not to diagnose something, diagnosing it is what is going to make you get it. Like, this mentality doesn't work. It's a mentality of timid men. And it says in scripture that the effeminate and the timid will not enter the kingdom of Elohim. So he continues, it is obvious, of course, that the external symptoms of any disease can be more readily detected than its internal causes. For these symptoms strike the eye more easily. This is also the reason why so many people recognize only external effects and mistake them for causes. Indeed, they will sometimes try to deny the existence of such causes. And that is why the majority of people among us recognize the German collapse only in the prevailing economic distress and the results that have followed therefrom. Notice how they allow you to read the writings of Marcus Aurelius. You can read the writings of Kaiser Augustus. But even though those were wicked men too, Kaiser was a genocidal maniac. He genocided the Gauls and a lot of Celts. And but they don't want you reading this book. It's like, shouldn't we read the books of these men and understand what they are presenting? Because it's a point of view that gives you psychological value. How are you going to know how to spot Darth Vader if you don't even read his book? And then he gets elected. It's like, what? So he says, and that is why the majority of people among us recognize the German collapse only in the prevailing economic distress and the results that have followed therefrom. Almost everyone has to carry his share of this burden, and that is why each one looks on the economic catastrophe as the cause of the present deplorable state of affairs. The broad masses of the people see little of the cultural, political, and moral background of this collapse. Many of them completely lack both the necessary feeling and powers of understanding for it. That the masses of the people should thus estimate the causes of Germany's downfall is quite understandable, but the fact that intelligent sections of the community regard the German collapse primarily as an economic catastrophe and consequently think that a cure for it may be found in economic solution or a businessman becoming president seems to me to be the reason why hitherto no improvement has been brought about. No improvement can be brought about until it be understood that economics play only a second or third role, while the main part is played by political, moral, and racial factors. I'm putting the quotations this time. Only when this is understood will it be possible to understand the causes of the present evil and consequently to find the ways and means of redeeming them. So now this is page 189, a 40-minute mark. Therefore, the question of why Germany really collapsed is one of the most urgent significance, especially for a political movement which aims at overcoming this disaster. I'll tell you why most empires collapse, and that is because they feared rather those who destroy the body and can do nothing afterwards, instead of fearing the one after destroying the body can throw the being or the soul into Gehenna, which is the burning place, the hellfire. That's why most nations collapse. Even though I don't endorse Reagan, there was a nice quote he probably got from somebody else, and that was, "A nation not under God is a nation gone under." That's why I play that clip from him. Because even though he might have different means and negative means in saying it, playing that clip while showing all those Freemasons in the background is very important. That's why I play that. So he continues, in scrutinizing the past with a view to discovering in scrutinizing the past with a view to discovering the causes of the German breakup, it is necessary to be careful lest we may be unduly impressed by external results that readily strike the eye and thus ignore the less manifest causes of these results, like stimulus checks. The most facile, and therefore the most generally accepted, he says, way of accounting for the present misfortune is to say that it is the result of a lost war or lost election, and that this is the real cause of the present misfortune. Probably there are many who honestly believe in this absurd explanation, but there are many more in whose mouths it is a deliberate and conscious falsehood. This applies to all those who are now feeding at the government troughs, for the prophets of the revolution again and again declared to the people that it would be immaterial to the great masses what the result of the war might be. On the contrary, they solemnly assured the public that it was high finance, which was principally interested in a victorious outcome of this gigantic struggle among the nations, but that the German people and the German workers had no interest whatsoever in such an outcome. Indeed, listen to the words he says. Indeed, the apostles of world conciliation habitually asserted that, far from any German downfall, the opposite was bound to take place, namely, the resurgence of the German people. Once militarism had been crushed, Apologize. Mr. Hittite continues, did not these self-same circles, seeing the praises of the Entente, and did they not also lay the whole blame for the sanguinary struggle on the shoulders of Germany? I don't know these Babylon words, so. Without this explanation, he says, would they have been able to put forward the theory that a military defeat would have no political consequences for the German people? Was not the whole revolution dressed up in gala colors as blocking the victorious advance of the German banners, and that thus the German people would be assured its liberty both at home and abroad? Is not that so, you miserable lying rascals? That kind of impudence, which is typical of jays, he says, remember he's covering for Soviets, was necessary in order to proclaim the defeat of the army as the cause of the German collapse. Indeed, the Berlin Vorwärts, that organ and mouthpiece of sedition, then wrote on this occasion that the German nation should not be permitted to bring home its banners triumphantly. and yet they attribute our collapse to the military defeat. Of course, it would be out of the question to enter into the argument with these liars who deny at one moment what they said the moment before. I should waste no further words on them. Were it not for the fact that there are many thoughtless people who repeat all this in parrot fashion, without being necessarily inspired by any evil motives. But the observations I am making here are also meant for our fighting followers. Seeing that nowadays once spoken words are often forgotten and twisted in their meaning. This is now page 190 at the 46-minute mark. Talking about forgotten and twisted. He continues, the assertion that the loss of the war was the cause of the German collapse can best be answered as follows. It is admittedly a fact that the loss of the war was of tragic importance for the future of our country, but that loss was not in itself a cause. It was rather the consequences of other causes. Remember to try to apply this in America the last couple decades to get a context of Trump and everything. He continues, that is, that a disastrous ending to this life or death conflict must have invoked catastrophes in its train was clearly seen by everyone of insight who can think in a straightforward manner. But unfortunately, there were also people whose powers of understanding seemed to fail them at the critical moment. And there were other people who had first questioned that truth and then altogether denied it. And there were people who, after their secret desire had been fulfilled, were suddenly faced with the subsequent facts that resulted from their own collaboration. Such people are responsible for the collapse and not the lost war, though they now want to attribute everything to this. As a matter of fact, the loss of the war was a result of their activities and not the result of bad leadership, as they now would like to maintain. Remember, that's his perception based on where they compartmentalized him. But it's always going to be the fact of a nation without God is a nation gone under. So he continues, our enemies were not cowards. They also know how to die. From the very first day of the war, they outnumbered the German army, and the arsenals and armament factories of the whole world were at their disposal for the replenishment of military equipment. I don't know. In Russia, the first waves they sent, which I'm going to guess were Slavic and more Semitic, they just let them get in a meat grinder. And then they kind of like got some stuff later on, but you're going to have to read that yourself. Russian history of the Tsars. Indeed, he says, it is universally admitted that the German victories, which had been steadily won during 4 years of warfare against the whole world, were due to superior leadership, apart, of course, from the heroism of the troops. And the organization was solely due to the German military leadership. That organization and leadership of the German army was the most mighty thing that the world has ever seen. Any shortcomings which became evident were humanly unavoidable. The collapse of that army was not the cause of our present distress. It was itself the consequence of other faults, but this consequence in its turn ushered in a further collapse which was more visible. That such was actually the case can be shown as follows. Must a military defeat necessarily lead to such a complete overthrow of the state and nation? Whenever has this been the result of an unlucky war? As a matter of fact, are nations ever ruined by a lost war, and by that alone? The answer to this question can be briefly stated by referring to the fact that military defeats are the result of internal decay, cowardice, want of character, and are a retribution for such things. If such were not the causes, then a military defeat would lead to a national resurgence and bring the nation to a higher pitch of effort. A military defeat is not the tombstone of national life. History affords innumerable examples to confirm the truth of that statement. Yeah. So he's telling you a truth, but only to lead you to something else. They only send you in a spiral, go down in the middle, a teth, basically. He continues, unfortunately, Germany's military overthrow was not an undeserved catastrophe, but a well-merited punishment, which was in the nature of an eternal retribution. Remember, he never gives glory to Elohim. It's just these powers that be. So this is page 191 now at the 51-minute mark. His defeat was more than deserved by us, he says, but it represented the greatest external phenomenon of decomposition among a series of internal phenomena, which, although they were visible, were not recognized by the majority of the people, who follow the tactics of the ostrich and see only what they want to see. Let us examine the symptoms that were evident in Germany at the time that the German people accepted this defeat. Is it not true that in several circles the misfortunes of the fatherland were even joyfully welcomed in the most shameful manner? Who can act in such a way without thereby meriting vengeance for his attitude? Were there not people who even went further and boasted that they had gone to the extent of weakening the front and causing a collapse? Therefore, it was not the enemy who brought this disgrace upon our soldiers, but rather our own countrymen. If they suffered misfortune for it afterwards, was that misfortune undeserved? Was there ever a case in history where a people declared itself guilty of a war, and that even against its better conscience and its better knowledge? So what's very interesting here is that what is it? Misfortune. I lost the thought I was going to say. Just continue here. Mr. Hittite says, no, and again no. In the manner in which the German nation reacted to its defeat, we can see that the real cause of our collapse must be looked for elsewhere, and not in the purely military loss of a few positions or the failure of an offensive. For if the front as such had given way and thus brought about a national disaster, then the German nation would have accepted the defeat in quite another spirit. Oh, I was gonna say, if he's saying this is a superior race, then why is it losing in battle at all, despite moral or psychological attacks? It should be impossible physically to break it, right? Oh, but it's because they're mixed stock. It's like Germany's always been mixed stock. You see how this guy just... It's identity politics. Excuse me. He continues here. They would have borne the subsequent misfortune with clenched teeth, or they would have been overwhelmed by sorrow. Regret and fury would have filled their hearts against an enemy into whose hands victory had been given by a chance event or the decree of fate. And in that case, the nation, following the example of the Roman Senate, would have faced the defeated legions on their return and expressed their thanks for the sacrifices that had been made, and would have requested them not to lose faith in the empire. Even the capitulation, which would have been signed under the sway of calm reason, while the heart would have beaten in the hope of the coming rematch. That is the reception that would have been given to a military defeat, which had to be attributed only to the adverse decree of fortune. There would have been neither joy-making nor dancing. Cowardice would not have been boasted of, and the defeat would not have been honored. On returning from the front, the troops would not have been mocked at, and the colors would not have been dragged in the dust. Above all, that disgraceful state of affairs could never have arisen which induced a British officer, Colonel Repington, that's Rampan, To declare with scorn, every third German is a traitor, no, in such a case, this plague would never have assumed the proportions of a veritable flood, which, for the past 5 years, has smothered every vestige of respect for the German nation in the outside world. This is now page 192, the 55-minute mark. I'll finish this page. This shows only too clearly how false it is to say that the loss of the war was the cause of the German breakup. No, the military defeat was itself but the consequence of a whole series of morbid symptoms and their causes which had become active in the German nation before the war broke out. If you want context into this and every other nation's experience before it falls, read Isaiah chapters 1 through 7. Mr. Hittite continues, the war was the first catastrophic consequence, visible to all, of how traditions and national morale had been poisoned and how the instinct of self-preservation had degenerated. These were the preliminary causes which for many years had been undermining the foundations of the nation and the empire. But it remained for the Jays, he says, which he's covering up for Soviets, with their unqualified capacity for falsehood and their fighting comrades, the Marxists, to impute responsibility for the downfall precisely to the man who alone had shown a superhuman will and energy in his effort to prevent the catastrophe which he had foreseen and to save the nation from that hour of complete overthrow and shame. By placing responsibility for the loss of the World War on the soldiers of Ludendorff, they took away the weapon of moral right from the only adversary dangerous enough to be likely to succeed in bringing the betrayers of the fatherland to justice. Now, all of this next paragraph here is underlined for some reason. Let's see. He says, all this was inspired by the principle, which is quite true in itself, that in the big lie, oh, it's because this is the famous big lie quote. I think that's why it's underlined. He says, all this was inspired by the principle, which is quite true in itself, that in the big lie, there is always a certain force of credibility, because the broad masses of a nation are always more easily corrupted in the deeper strata of their emotional nature than consciously or voluntarily, and thus in the primitive simplicity of their minds, they more readily fall victim to the big lie than the small lie. That's why they had to do NASA and why they had to do MAGA and all this stuff. And SpaceX and everything. And Starlink, which didn't exist until those lights appeared in the sky. And I know it because I researched that every day. And I never heard anything about it until right after I saw them in the sky. Then all of a sudden Starlink exists. It's like, okay, buddy. No, the stars are withholding their light. Oh no, it's Elon Musk is blocking them out. Oh yeah, Mr. Burns blocks out the sun. We get it. You all watch The Simpsons. You all believe in cartoons. He continues, since they themselves often tell small lies in little matters, but would be ashamed to resort to large-scale falsehoods, it would never come into their heads to fabricate colossal untruths, and they would not believe that others could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously. Even though the facts which prove this to be so may be brought clearly to their minds, they will still doubt and waver, and will continue to think that there may be some other explanation. For the grossly impudent lie always leaves traces behind it, even after it has been nailed down. A fact which is known to all expert liars in this world and to all who conspire together in the art of lying. These people know only too well how to use falsehood for the basest purposes. So they'll call a Soviet a J, and they'll call a Christian a social democrat in order to veil their hatred as some kind of political party. but they've always tried to call Hebrews and Christians communists. They try to call Christians atheists or nihilists or haters of everybody. It's like, just because they don't see their flesh as the ultimate. So with that, I'm going to start a song here. Let's see. Which one am I going to pick here? Oh, I know which one. Let me see if oh, there it is. This is such a weird song if you can hear what the guy's saying.
Yo, yo.
Monmouth's execution was a particularly messy affair, as it took 5 chops. Just as they were about to bury the 2 bits, some bright spark realised that there wasn't a proper portrait of the ex-duke. As he was the illegitimate son of Charles II, he thought they'd better get one done. They therefore sewed his head back on his bottle, put him back in his clothes, sat him in a chair and...
Bob's your uncle.